In Oliver Sacks' 1985 book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales, he recounts the story of a man he refers to as Dr. P, a music teacher who first noticed that he could not recognize his students by their faces, and then gradually could not recognize simple objects or even his own wife. He had no trace of dementia, he was perfectly intelligent, humorous, and imaginative, and yet could not recognize simple everyday things by sight. Mistaking his own foot for his shoe, mistaking water hydrants and parking meters for children, and as the title says, mistaking his own wife for a hat, as he reached out and tried to lift her head to put it on. He could, however, identify platonic solids. He could identify cartoons, such as the stylized illustrations on playing cards, or the large cigar of a drawing of Churchill. He could also identify some people by recognizing prominent markers, like the square jaw and large teeth of his brother, or the characteristic hair and mustache of a portrait of Einstein. He would try to identify things not by obvious judgment, the way we naturally recognize things, but by their physical makeup, their very literal features. Dr. P would describe things like a rose, not realizing it's a rose, as something 6 inches in length, a convoluted red form with a linear green attachment, or glove as a continuous surface, enfolded on itself and having 5 outpouchings. It seems Dr. P constructed the world as a computer constructed it, by means of key features and schematic relationships, in a slow, inefficient, and oftentimes ineffective way. His ability to recognize faces, scenes, and many objects through visualization was profoundly impaired in quite a bewildering way. Dr. P had visual agnosia, a severe impairment in recognition of visually presented objects, a disease that advanced until his death. This case is a testament to the complexity of visual processing, and also a testament to the mysteries of the brain. So, if you could project your visual mind onto a screen, what do you think you would see? What if we could take the images you see in your visual imagination, something people usually refer to as the mind's eye, convert them into pixels and project them onto a screen? What kind of images would be there? Would this make the jobs of artists in all fields immensely easier? Could events of a crime scene be perfectly played out by an eyewitness and used as evidence in court? Could a movie director imagine the exact way he wants a scene to look and pass it off to the cameraman with no words exchanged between them? Or would everything just be a blurry, incoherent mess with no use to anyone? These are some of those questions you think up in grade school while experiencing the grueling boredom of public education. And the first mistake is assuming everyone has a visual imagination. This condition of being unable to visualize something in your mind has only recently been given a name, aphantasia, and like many things it exists on a spectrum. People with aphantasia can't form mental images whatsoever, but people can also visualize something very strongly or very weakly. Confusingly, people with aphantasia may be able to dream, but can't recall those dreams when they're awake, only the experience of that dream. Some may also be able to not recall things visually, but still recall other things quite vividly, like sound, taste, touch, or smell, although many don't. People with aphantasia are much more common than you may realize. 2% of the population is estimated to have it, and yet many of them don't even realize they have it until later in life. To them, the mind's eye seems like nothing more than a silly expression. Many can still remember things and tell the difference between things when shown them. They can recall things in non-visual ways, such as recalling the concept of something through words. They live almost completely normal lives. Many resources describe this apple test, asking if you can imagine an apple. What color is it? Where is it located? Can you rotate it in your mind? The vividness and detail of such an image can range from absolutely nothing, to a poor wavering image, to something seen so perfectly it's almost indistinguishable from reality. I do not think I have aphantasia. I would say I even have a slightly above average visual imagination. I can imagine the apple. In fact, I can spin it around and notice all the irregularities in its color and texture. I can imagine it on a table and the shadow it casts. Now, concentrating and turning that visual into a detailed image on paper without any other reference images to fill in the gaps of information is much more difficult. As someone without aphantasia, I find it difficult to only recall the concept of, say, my house, as opposed to the literal visual image of it. I imagine the facade or the floor plan, and sometimes the arrangement of objects in my home whenever it is brought up. However, I realize I don't have visual imagery for abstract concepts such as truth or justice. I don't need visuals for them. I just understand them inherently. Is this in some way similar to the way people with aphantasia understand concrete things? Am I right or wrong with this comparison? People with aphantasia, feel free to tell me in the comments. And yet there are also aphantasiac artists. Yes, people who can't visualize things, making visuals. One way they can do this is by looking at lots and lots of reference images, something that artists already do regularly. Or they can go through rigorous trial and error, thinking about all the elements that need to go into an image, and making marks and generating stuff from those marks and erasing and changing elements and moving them around, but never actually picturing anything. Despite the fact I can visualize things I am familiar with without too much effort and with a decent amount of detail, I can draw not because I simply imagine things better. I mean, it helps, but the abilities I've trained over several years probably have more to do with being able to render that apple than simply imagining it. I can imagine a shadow on a ball, but breaking it down into the proper order and then using that as a guide to render that shadow is much more helpful. This all leads one to wonder, if you could project your imagination onto a screen, how well rendered would that image even be? For the average person, not someone with aphantasia or on the other side of the spectrum, hyperphantasia, which is extremely vivid mental imagery, what would this machine actually produce from their minds? Well, before we answer that, first we'd have to look at what does exist. There are in fact mind-reading machines already out there. In 2001, scientists were able to get a computer program to identify what someone was looking at that moment by teaching the computer program to read patterns gathered from functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, to see what areas of the brain are active during tasks, and associate categories of pictures or concepts with those patterns. For a while, it has been known that many visual areas in the brain react strongly to the orientation of edges, combining them to build pictures of the world. It would make sense that our visual systems would pay attention to edges. They are the things that separate objects from one another and from the background. As Richard Maslin points out in his book, We Know It When We See It, our visual system is arranged so that it emphasizes the structures where change is happening and downplays places in the image where not much is happening, such as the middle of a clear sky, or the interior of a solid colored surface. Once you have edges and orientation of edges down, you can actually identify a lot without any more information. By applying brain decoding methods using fMRI data, researchers in 2005 were able to tell the orientation of lines they had shown volunteers through voxel mosaics gathered from their brain activity. In 2008, Jack Gallant's lab at the University of California, Berkeley, developed a decoder that could identify which out of 120 pictures a subject was viewing, and then they took it one step further. This is the result of their program's attempt at reconstructing video that the subjects had seen using nothing but decoding brain activity patterns and 5,000 hours of randomly selected YouTube clips, where 100 of those clips were taken whose predicted activity was most similar to the observed brain activity and averaged together. As you can see, the result is frankly nightmarish. Like an animated version of the kinds of images gathered from mashing a bunch of photos together in a neural network such as ArtBreeder. Obviously, some things are more accurate and some things are less so, as Jack Gallant explains.
When the movie that we showed has a fairly common object like a person, our reconstructions are actually fairly accurate. When the movie that we showed is something rarer, as you'll see in a second, like this abstract thing, then our reconstructions are coarser.
Now this is of course a very limited reconstruction with limited data. One limitation Gallant's team had is that they took snapshots of the brain only every 1 or 2 seconds, but the reconstruction is happening at the rate of the film. His colleagues even told him this limitation meant it probably wouldn't have worked at all. Another limitation is that fMRI measures blood flow to the brain, consequent to neural activity, not the actual neurons themselves. fMRI only has modest temporal resolution. As a result, much of the information contained in the underlying neural activity is lost. This is also just decoding what people are seeing in front of them. It's not really visualizing things in your mind. their brains are simultaneously being shown those things. A closer version of this mind-reading machine comes from a Japanese lab which was able to show a dream decoded from subjects' brain activity. Participants were allowed to fall asleep in a brain scanner. Then, they were woken up periodically to recall what they had seen. The team apparently tried to reconstruct the actual visual information, but eventually resorted to word categories. The program was able to predict with 60% accuracy what categories of objects were seen in people's dreams. However, the unusual nature of dreams made extracting further information more difficult. Yukiyasu Kamatani, the leader of the team, commented, "When I think of my dream contents, I have the feeling I'm seeing something, but dreams may engage more than just the brain's visual realm, and involve areas for which it's harder to build reliable models." Kamatani has developed image reconstruction machines even further recently by using neural networks in conjunction with fMRI brain decoding, producing these kinds of images from subjects' brain activity. It's pretty similar in nightmare quality to Gallant's work, but with some more defined features generated with the neural network. Basic shapes produced even more recognizable images. Now, recalling these shapes produced less accurate images, but you can still kind of see what it was going for. Recalled pictures that weren't just basic shapes, however, produced basically nothing useful. Again, this is all very, very limited, but maybe it could point in the direction to how the average person visualizes things in their mind, paying attention to distinct features and general shapes, while ignoring or inaccurately remembering less important details like backgrounds. Now, don't get me wrong, this is impressive, but it's not really what I have in mind when I think of mind-reading machines. As Jack Gallant puts it,
"We're not doing mind reading here. We're not really peering into your brain and reconstructing pictures in your head. We're reading your brain activity and using that brain activity to reconstruct what you saw." And those are two very, very different things.
mind-reading machines exist for other things as well, not just visual imagery. Things like words and intentions can be read from brain activity, although intentions can be difficult to decode. In one amusing account, Gallant's team attempted to see if they could read the intentions of a subject playing Counter-Strike. All they could decode was the intention to move around, but everything else in the fMRI data was overwhelmed by the signals from participants' emotions when they were fired at or killed. These mind-reading reconstruction programs are still just a very limited computer's guess that takes things that are already available and merges them together. It's a lot more realistic than whatever hypothetical literal mind-to-screen machine I made up, but I like to think that our visual perception and imagery of the world is a tad more comprehensible than this. Back to that question about rendering quality. As you saw, these computer programs made reconstructions from already existing footage and averaged them all together. It can't tell us very much. So the answer to this entire question is, we don't know. Yeah, a bit disappointing. To my knowledge, there is no machine out there that can literally take the information of your mind's eye and project that onto a screen for all to see with 100% accuracy. But I do have a few hypotheses. There is very little evolutionary advantage in remembering every detail from every single physical object you've ever seen. I really doubt that even very imaginative people would give a crystal clear picture of whatever they're thinking. Human brains constantly misremember details. Eyewitness testimony is far less infallible than most people believe. Simple things like the Mandela effect demonstrate that masses of people constantly will make up and change visual information. I don't think visualizing things would be much different. You might be able to get some clear key features rendered, but the rest might be either blurry or flat out wrong. However, if this machine did exist, I think the average person would imagine faces, especially faces of loved ones, more strongly than most other things. Humans have astonishing facial perception capabilities, going so far as to see faces even when there aren't any. A team from the University of Oregon in 2016 used the same sort of fMRI brain decoding to produce these faces from 23 participants. Now, getting the subjects to hold the image of a face in their minds and have the AI reconstruct it from their memory was a bit tougher, resulting in these images. Again, it's not really mind reading, and of course all these faces are pretty wonky, but it does show that it is possible, and will almost certainly be more fine-tuned in the future. Edge and edge orientation, like I mentioned earlier, would probably also be quite strong. I predict for the average person that there would be a lot of messed up, confusing images mixed with some identifiable features. It might look a bit like something from Artbreeder or Ivan Seal. Computers may have to implement some kind of quality filter that recognizes what you are thinking about and enhances it. I think it would take an incredibly, unusually hyper-imaginative mind to generate something very clear. It might take the imagination of, say, someone like Nikola Tesla, who is known for having an astonishing visual imagination. In the book, The Prodigal Genius, John J. O'Neill writes, "If he thought of an object, it would appear before him, exhibiting the appearance of solidity and massiveness. So greatly did these visions possess the attributes of actual objects that it was usually difficult for him to distinguish between vision and reality." Nikola Tesla didn't need models or drawings. He would just visualize it and build it. And what would people with neurological conditions like Dr. P see? A man who could see everything clearly, but recognize nothing. What about people with aphantasia? Would it really be just pure nothing? The current technology is expensive and limited, but in the near future, we may be able to get all kinds of data from differing human perceptions. The truth is, the way people visualize things or don't is more complex than it may appear, and can differ greatly from person to person. In one astonishingly ironic example, Chuck Close, the famous portrait artist, has prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize people by their faces. However, he says, "Once I change the face into a two-dimensional object, I can commit it to memory. I have a photographic memory for things that are two-dimensional." The obvious benefits of this tech is that a new realm of communication could be opened for people with neurological disabilities. There are also, of course, ethical issues. Can the data in your mind, your shopping preferences, be decoded and extracted for use by corporations? Can mental hospitals monitor your inner thoughts to try and treat you? Should people be allowed to invade your thoughts if you've been accused of a crime? Well, you can rest assured that the technology we have right now is pretty limited and legally useless. For now. Except in India. In a murder case, where a judge cited a brain scan as proof that the suspect's brain held experiential knowledge about the crime that only the killer could possess, sentencing her to life in prison. The inventors claim the technology, named the Brain Electrical Oscillation Signature Test, can distinguish between people's memories of events they witnessed and between deeds they committed. Now keep in mind this was in 2008, and no studies of BEOS have even been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals proving it works. If this one fluke in the legal system is possible, imagine what could be done with today's technology or even mind-reading tech in the future. These ethical questions will have to be answered. Some ethicists argue that privacy laws should protect the inner thoughts of a person, while others, such as Australian philosopher and neuroethicist Julian Salvescu, say, people have a fear of brain decoding technologies, but if it's used in the right way, it's enormously liberating. I don't see why we should privilege people's thoughts over their words. Maybe there's a reason beyond pure efficiency that nature chose to let us communicate through words and drawings, rather than through mind reading. Chose to let us be capable of lying. I used to think, man, if people could know exactly what I was thinking, exactly what I was feeling, things would be so much easier. But maybe that's only true to an extent. I mean, we have the ability to say exactly what we're thinking already, but people still get into conflicts constantly. I mean, do you always know exactly what you want? Do you always know exactly how you feel? Do you truly understand yourself? Can you point to the memory, the image, the sentence that forms that specific part of your personality? Can you point to that thing that makes you think in that way? Because most of the time, I can't. A big part of the creative process is realizing that what's in your mind is probably not always the best solution. By translating it from our minds to paper or a screen, we work out the bugs. We can find better ways of creating that piece of art or fixing that problem. Hell, even the very medium you're working in, graphite, oil paint, broken glass, can influence how something looks that maybe you didn't intend. Maybe it makes it better. Perhaps we are the quality filters. My final prediction is that this technology will probably advance to a point where it becomes really impressive, but it may not be the revolution in creativity, forensics, or emotional understanding we think it is. Let us not stumble into the arrogance of our own technology. What makes us think that some mind-reading machine would really make our minds all that more clear? Currently, the best way to know what someone is thinking is to ask them, and the best way for other people to know what you're thinking is to be honest.